Welcome to the Living Out podcast, helping people, churches and society talk about faith and sexuality. Hello and welcome to the Living Out podcast, in which we like to talk about faith and sexuality. In this series, we're tackling questions that no one wants to answer. My name's Anne and I'll be hosting today's discussion on whether or not we should accept an invitation to a gay wedding. Alongside me are Andrew, Ed and Andy, ready to share their wisdom, I hope. It's great to have you guys along. To kick off, maybe you could tell us what's the most unusual wedding venue you've ever been to. Andy pulled a face just then, so I'm going to go to you first.
No, I'm not sure I've got a good answer to this. The worst wedding venue that I've been to was the one I almost didn't get to. When I was preaching at this wedding and sort of 20 minutes beforehand was completely lost. So that was the worst venue. To be honest, I've never been more relieved that a bride was late when I was preaching and was late myself. So the venue was actually quite boring. It was just a church in a town I didn't know very well. But so I've got a wedding venue getting lost story. But frankly, all my other venues have been fairly boring church buildings, actually.
I got lost going to a wedding once because they'd accidentally got 2 digits of the postcode round the wrong way on the invitation. So it meant a lot of us were spending a long time going around the one-way system in Lancaster.
Wow.
Ed, where have weddings taken you?
To a lighthouse.
Ooh.
Yeah, so this was a couple who had a civil wedding ceremony and I was doing some prayers of Thanksgiving afterwards. But they're both quite shy and wanted a low-key wedding, and they wanted a wedding which would basically, they didn't want many people there, and they said they had to have a venue that would help their friends and family make sense of not many invitations. And turns out a lighthouse is the way to do that, because you could only fit, I think there must be about 10 of us there and the couple, all squeezed into one floor of a lighthouse somewhere in South Wales.
Wow, that's amazing.
Oh.
How about you, Andrew?
Well, I think I have no good answer to this, which basically proves Ed's friends are more interesting and exciting than mine and Andy's. And so my thing actually is, any of my friends who are listening who are going to get married, please pick somewhere interesting, because clearly people set the bar quite low. So they could host the most interesting wedding venue I could attend.
We could launch a competition, couldn't we, on this podcast?
Yeah.
Send Andrew to the most interesting location.
Yeah. I could be their prize. I'll come and live on at the party.
Yeah. Well, my brother got married in a lobster shack, which was pretty cool, right on the beach. So that was fun. I once went to a reception in a yurt, which I'm sure when they were planning it, that they were dreaming of all this sort of romantic, out in the wilds, in the scenery. It absolutely chucked it down. So basically, we were just wading through a swamp most of the time. Anyway, that's enough of wedding venues. Today's question, as I said, is should I go to a gay wedding? And that's what we'll be talking about now. Increasing numbers of gay couples are choosing to get married, and at some point will be likely to be invited to a gay wedding if we haven't done so already. So it's important to think carefully and prayerfully about how we can respond to an invitation when it comes. So I thought when we're discussing this question, first of all, it'd be helpful to zoom back and ask ourselves, what is a marriage? What is a wedding? How can we understand that from a biblical perspective?
I think, a Christian wedding just has a few components, if I can put it like that. It's not a very romantic way of putting it. But, you're expecting from a biblical point of view that it's going to be a Christian man and a Christian woman who are getting married, if we're talking about a Christian wedding. You're talking about them wanting to commit to a lifelong union, that this being something they're going to do until death us do part, as the vows say. And you're wanting that to be no sort of previous marriage, because marriage is for life, unless there's been marital unfaithfulness in a previous marriage from the other partner. You're probably wanting to say that, that there shouldn't have been a previous marriage, because marriage is lifelong. And so you're sort of going back to Genesis 2 there for the idea of it being a man and a woman, lifelong union. Mark 10 verse 9, Jesus is, really keen on that and talks about that and human beings not separating what God has joined together, words that are used in the marriage service. And the whole idea about marriage divorce only be permitted when marital unfaithfulness happens. Jesus speaking in Matthew 5 verse 32. So I think those are the sort of things. Those are sort of the components I think need to be present for me to really want to celebrate a wedding. It's a man and a woman. They're both Christians. They're committed to a lifelong union, and neither of them have been married before, unless one of them was married to somebody who was unfaithful to them. And those are the sort of things I'm looking for in a good marriage. A marriage I want to celebrate. And when one of those things or some of those things have been missing in a marriage, those are the moments when I've actually sort of held back from going to be part of the celebration of a wedding. Because I felt that, if it's, for instance, been a Christian marrying an unchristian, or when somebody's getting married and they were unfaithful to their former husband or wife, that's stopped me from going. Or I wish I'd known this, but I was once at a wedding where instead of promising to love each other until death us do part, they talked about staying committed to each other as long as love lasts. And that wasn't a Christian wedding. That was just a contractual arrangement that they were keeping, as long as they both felt good about it. And that's the sort of wedding that actually, had I known beforehand, that's the sort of thing they were going to be saying, I would have been so keen to celebrate it.
Mm. So there's a clear definition of what marriage is in the Bible, and for you to be able to go to a wedding, you would have to be sort of confident that the marriage, that the wedding is in line with those biblical principles.
Yeah, particularly because what is an invitation to a wedding is an invitation to celebrate something, isn't it? Mm. And if there's aspects of it that I can't celebrate, I'm going to be a bit of a party pooper. And people don't, I'm a bit of a party pooper most of the time anyway, but people don't want somebody there who is going to be thinking, I'm not sure this should be happening. And I'm not sure you should be getting married to this non-Christian, or I'm not sure you should be getting married again after you were so unfaithful to your previous husband or wife. Or I don't think you should be getting married to another man or to another woman.
So this raises an interesting question, I guess. All of us here would hold to that definition of marriage that you clearly articulated. So I guess the question is then, when deciding whether to go to a wedding or not, does going to a wedding sort of signal endorsement of what the couple are doing? Does it mean that we are approving of that union? Can we separate out attendance at a wedding from what we believe and hold true about marriage? What do people think about that?
I think that's so important, because I would agree wholeheartedly what Ed said and what a marriage is, but I'd add a point that actually a marriage is recognised by a community. It's different to two people just deciding we're going to stick together for life, we're going to live together, whatever, in a kind of just, not a hidden way, but in a way not particularly recognised and acknowledged by the community as having a start point. The wedding is the start point of that. And I do think that's a biblical principle. People often ask the interesting question of, why do we insist on marriage ceremonies that we have them now, when that isn't what was happening in biblical times and kind of Old Testament times? And actually it's because the marriage ceremony today is the way we publicly as a community endorse the start of this relationship. In Old Testament times, that happened because you basically got married by sleeping together, but that was, everyone knew that's what you were going to go and do. That's what a wedding basically is, isn't it? They're going to have sex, the relationship starting. That just used to happen in the ancient world, where basically you go into your tent, the whole community would know that's what was happening, your marriage started. So I think part of what's going on at a wedding is the community acknowledging, endorsing, supporting the formation of this relationship. And therefore, I do think that attending a wedding is inherently approving of and endorsing and playing that role in that relationship. I think it might be hard to attend a wedding and to not be, just by attendance, endorsing in that way.
I think that's a key question, because it seems to me that if you view attending a wedding as giving approval to it, that's quite actually a high bar for whether you go to a wedding. I think if that's the position you take, you probably can't ever go to any sort of wedding between two people of the same sex, it would seem to me, because you would be there saying, I'm approving this. I think if you take a different line to say, look, I've had conversations with people, they know I don't approve, I'm here because I have a concern for them and I want to be there as a friend for them, that's a slightly different bar. And I think one of the questions that a Christian needs to to determine is, what do they think they're implying by going to this wedding? And that's one individual Christians need to make their own conscience clear on that. What am I saying by going to this wedding? And be clear in their own minds what that is.
And I found that helpful on the sense of, if you have a clear understanding of what a wedding is, there'll be some things you're invited to, and as it were, they think it's a wedding, and you think, actually, this isn't. I'm going along to something, they're wanting me to celebrate this. Actually, I'm willing to go and celebrate some of that, but not everything they think it's going to be. And I've certainly been in that scenario where I've been asked to a wedding, and there's some of what they're wanting to celebrate that I'm up for celebrating, but there's some that I'm not. And that's when, so often, whether they're or not the couple are Christian or non-Christian, has come into play as being something else that's helped me work out, is this actually a wedding, or is this just two people who love each other making a temporary commitment to each other? And I've certainly been to a wedding which really was that, and they're not Christians. They were, people relatively close to me. I wanted to celebrate their love for each other and their desire to commit to each other for this period of time. But in my mind, I was quite clear that I wasn't going to a wedding. And that's how I suppose I resolved it in my conscience. And I don't think they were really at one level. If I pushed them, we didn't sit down and have the conversation, but they weren't getting married in the Christian understanding of getting married. They were just wanting a party to celebrate a temporary commitment they were making to each other.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's how maybe there is a distinction then in the way that we approach things with non-Christians and with Christians, because certainly I've been to the same sort of thing. I've got non-Christian family and been to a wedding that has had absolutely nothing to do with God deliberately, and it has been just a sort of a contract between two people and a celebration of their love and, a nice party and everything like that. And I feel less uncomfortable about going to that than I would to going to a wedding between two Christians who are holding a different view of sexuality to the one that I'm holding.
I entirely agree with that. So at one level, the answer to this question is, could I ever go to a gay wedding that was inviting God to bless this? I don't think there's any way I could ever go to that, actually, because there would just be I would just know this is completely and utterly false. This is different to what God regards as good. And I do think there's a biblical distinction, actually, between how we treat Christian and non-Christian things in that regard. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul will talk about the need for the church to be holy on sexual areas, at the same time as saying it's not his role to judge unbelievers acting as unbelievers. And so that's why, for me, I do draw a slight distinction in this. There's no way I would go to a so-called Christian gay wedding, because Christian marriage is called to be pure, called to be distinct, called to be male-female. It's slightly different, I think, for a non-Christian who's not really claiming for God to be involved in this at all. At least there's an integrity in that that might at least be possible.
Do you think there's a difference as well about whether you're being asked to take part? I mean, we've talked a little bit about maybe even attending if it's a Christian wedding, if it's a wedding that's asking God to bless things, then even just being there is taking part because it's an act done in community, as Andrew says. What about if we were asked to participate in some way, like, doing a reading or doing a song or something like that? Well, nobody's going to ask me to do a song.
With your ukulele, they might do.
Oh dear, that's not a great start to anyone's wedding, is it? Do you think that makes a difference at all as to whether we would go to a wedding or not?
I suppose we're talking about, we'll probably talk about the nature and content of the ceremony. Will be one thing that might affect things, and how involved you're going to be. So, for instance, I can think of a friend of mine who had a gay couple who invited them to a wedding which included a service of blessing in a Christian context, and they met up with them and said, "Look, we really can't go to that for the reasons that Andy set out." and they sat down with the couple and explained why. But they did decide to go along to the evening reception because they wanted to continue the relationship that they had with this couple and the friendship they had with this couple. And they felt that there was a distinction between the two. So I imagine, again, that would also apply to sort of what you might, what taking part might involve. If it's a totally non-Christian ceremony and you're asked to read, I don't know, a poem or sing a song, that is very different to being asked to preach a sermon or to take the service or to read part of the Bible, which would all imply, which would be, again, creating the implication that God approves and you approve, which would just be dishonest. And the great thing about this story, actually, between these friends who spoke to their friends who were getting married, was just they were open and honest about what they were doing and why they were doing it. And they had a good conversation that explained to this couple why they couldn't be part of the blessing, but why they were going to go to the party. And I think open communication and honesty is a really, let's be honest, Christianity takes honesty really seriously. And we should all be very careful about not lying and, as it were, keeping to our conscience and preserving our conscience in these things.
So is this then... Do you think this whole question about whether to go to a gay wedding or not is a matter of individual conscience and prayerfully considering some biblical principles and how to apply those? Or are there some sort of hard and fast rules? Is it something that Christians can agree to disagree on, do you think? Or is it a bit more nuanced than that?
I think it is a disputable matter, we might call it, of Christians being able to just take different views, partly because, as we said, it's not a one-size-fits-all phenomenon either, actually. It's so many different variables that can take place in what the ceremony is and who the couple are and how they view it and all that kind of stuff. So I think the complexity of that would make me think yes. And I think that there's biblical principle for disputable matters, Romans 14, those kind of places of actually, there are times when actually we have disagreements at how best to honour God in how we live our lives on things in which Scripture is not clear. And actually it's right for us to respect each other's conscience-based decisions in those contexts when they're not actually fundamental to the gospel. We can do that, and we to be sensitive to each other in that. So I think because the complexity of the matter and the fact there is biblical principle that we should be able to agree to disagree on some things when there's not clear scriptural teaching, I think I would feel, for me, it's in that kind of camp.
I agree with that. So with my sort of pastor hat on, I've had people in the congregation come to me talking about members of their family being involved in a gay marriage, and actually one family saying, we just can't in conscience go. Can you pray for us as we talk to our family? Another coming to me and saying, actually in conscience we've decided we can go. Can you pray that doesn't damage our witness? And actually I didn't try to dissuade either of them. I just said, okay, that's where you're landing with your conscience. I think had they been suggesting they would go to a Christian gay wedding, I would probably have tried to persuade them otherwise. But these were completely secular weddings, as it were. And I just respected their conscience, and I'd do the same again, actually.
That reminds me of a really helpful blog Ed wrote on a parallel issue on whether a Christian should wear a rainbow lanyard. And Ed's really helpful point was he has had people in his church who have reached different conclusions on that. And actually he's okay with that, because what he was glad about is they all seriously thought about it, wrestled with it, made their choice in seeing what they felt Scripture said, what they felt the Holy Spirit was leading them in. And so what he liked as a pastor was the fact his people were taking it seriously, wrestling with it, making a choice for their conscience rather than just going with the flow or not seeing it as significant. And I think that would be relevant to this point as well.
Andrea, I think that's a really helpful point, that it's important for people to be prayerfully considering their responses and not just going for something knee-jerk or not just going for what everybody else is doing. And I wonder whether Ed talked about other considerations in terms of whether to go to a marriage or not. I wonder whether there's a double standard applied when it comes to accepting or rejecting invitations to a gay marriage. As opposed to some of those instances where it's a heterosexual couple, but it might not be a godly marriage or godly wedding ceremony. How can we avoid sort of singling gay people out as the worst of the worst, or singling people out for special treatment?
Yeah, I mean, on this one, I said no to wedding invites. I can think of 2 times I said no to a wedding invitation. One was when a Christian was marrying an unchristian, and one was when someone was getting remarried after a marriage in which I felt they had been unfaithful to their previous wife. And in both those situations, I said, I can't be part of the celebration. And we had, let's be honest, quite painful discussions around that. Neither of those conversations were pleasant. It was a really sad thing to have to say that. But it does mean that if and when a gay friends of mine say, can you come to this Christian celebration of our wedding, I'll be able to say, I've been consistent. When biblical, as it were, when a biblical component of marriage has been missing, I haven't gone in the past. I'm not discriminating against you.
I think that's really important. The first wedding invitation I ever turned down for reasons of conscience rather than just because I couldn't make the date was a friend of mine who'd had an affair with a married man, and he'd left his wife to marry her, and I felt like there was unfinished business and unrepentance, and I just couldn't go and celebrate that wedding. And I tried to explain that as compassionately as possible to my friend, but that was a straight couple, straight Christian couple. I think it's just helpful for churches, church leadership to act consistently on this and to teach consistently on this, because I think there can sometimes be an assumption that if people are Christians and straight, then it's fine to go to their wedding, and if it's a gay couple, we should never go to the wedding. And actually, we need to sort of unpick it a bit more and think about what's going on underneath.
It's this thing, isn't it, which we probably mentioning a lot of context of taking the whole of biblical teaching across the board. And it's almost like if there are volume dials, where it's like the volume dial on kind of same-sex relationships, most of us instinctively have turned up quite high. We hear quite loudly what the Bible says about that. The volume dial actually on divorce, particularly remarriage, we don't actually. And we just don't hear people clearly lay down biblical teaching. And actually, I think most churches across the board have not probably wholeheartedly follow biblical teaching on that. And actually, we need to turn that volume dial up, which shows the fact and enacts the fact we're not picking on gay people. Actually, we're being faithful to God's word across the board.
That's great. Hello, Anne here, just letting you know that the Living Out Roadshow is now underway. We're coming to Leicester on Saturday the 5th of March and Lancaster on Saturday the 19th of March, with training on sexuality in our culture, the biblical picture, and how we can support same-sex attracted Christians at church. You can find out more and book at our website livingout.org. Also, our friends at True Freedom Trust are running a conference for same-sex attracted women in London on Saturday the 26th of February. Find out more and book at truefreedomtrust.co.uk. Welcome back. So we're talking about whether or not we should go to a gay wedding. And in the first section, we talked about some of the considerations that we need to think about when deciding how to respond. In this section, we're going to talk a bit more about how to actually manage those relationships, what to say to the couple about our decision, how to go forward with that. So what would you do if you decided not to go to somebody's wedding?
Well, we've already talked about honesty being important. What I wouldn't do is sort of pretend that I'm on holiday or, something else has come up or I can't get the time off work. I mean, it'd be very tempting, won't it, to hide behind one of those excuses. But I do hope I'll be honest enough to, have a conversation or to drop a note, depending again on the sort of the closeness of the relationship and the context of the relationship. Actually communicate why I'm not going to be there in a loving and gracious way that I hope might, it might be in the context of a conversation that I do that, or it might be a sort of an RSVP that invites a conversation. So, I'd love to talk to you about why I can't come in person if that would be helpful to you. So I think just honesty and communication and doing that in a way that's appropriate to the relationship you have with this person. And it's going to be very different, obviously, based on the sort of relationship you have with them.
I think there'd be multiple points to communicate there, because you want to communicate your RSVP, but also, if it's a close friendship, you also want to communicate, I still love you, I still want this friendship, in maintaining that. And I heard this great story of, I can't remember, it may be someone in this podcast, I can't remember who said this, but of having received the invite to a gay wedding, felt they couldn't go, communicated that. But literally the very next thing they said to the couple was, but we'd love to get you around for dinner as soon as you're back for honeymoon. And it was this like really embodied way of showing, we do feel in conscience we can't attend your wedding, but that doesn't mean we're rejecting you, doesn't mean we're ending this friendship. And they were really proactively showing that by saying, we want to hang out as soon as we can. And I loved that actually, because they're communicating the stance they feel they need to take, but also communicating their love, their acceptance, all that kind of stuff. I thought it was a beautiful, practical way of doing that.
In some ways, communicating is obviously going to depend on the context of the relationship, whether, if it's a work colleague or whether it's a close friend or whether it's family. Would that the nature of the relationship even influence whether you decide to go or not?
I think so. As in, I can, to not go to a brother or sister's wedding or a child's wedding or a parent's wedding is so much more significant because of how noticeable it would be and the impact it would have on family relationships than the work colleague or even the good friends. So I can think of some good friends whose weddings I have not been to because I couldn't make it. That would not have been the scenario with my siblings, or if I had kids, or if I had a parent who was getting married. So I think those are the sort of my presence would have been noticed in just a much more, or lack of presence would be noticed. So I just wanted to say there's just it is a different dynamic, and depending on the relationship and the impact my attendance or non-attendance would have on the continuation of that relationship with an unbelieving family member who I'm wanting to love like Jesus and point to Jesus, that might mean that I go. It might mean that I don't go, but I would be probably more open to the possibility because of my desire to keep the relationship going, to keep the relationship going with them and other family members, so I can win people to the gospel. Now, one pushback might be it's going to be more of a gospel witness to say no. And there might be some examples where actually it would be more of a gospel witness to say no. There might be some situations where it's actually more of a gospel witness to say, yes, this is why I'm coming. This is why I'm not going to take part in that part of the ceremony, but I'm able to be there as a witness, whatever it might be.
In terms of gospel witness, if we're talking about people who aren't Christians, there's always this tension, isn't there, of we always think of sexuality as like the presenting issue, the bury the main issue. That's not the main issue at all. The issue is, do they love and follow Jesus? Do they believe who he says who he is, and rose from the dead? And so actually, also the thing of what you're communicating, you want to remove barriers to be able to talk about Jesus and invite them to follow Jesus. And so that also for me would be a consideration. Actually, what I'm primarily called is not to sort out their ethics and their way of living, but actually to invite them to Jesus, and he will help them sort out their ethics and their way of living. So also for me, actually, one of the considerations actually of how do I best achieve that aim through my response and how I handle this.
Well, I think that's right, in as much as it's interesting how the New Testament regards who we associate with. So actually, the New Testament tells us, if I'm honest, to draw back from Christians who are obviously not living in a Christian way. The New Testament calls us, like Jesus, to be friends of sinners. And so it seems to me that the Christian, in one level, draws back and away from the professing Christian who's obviously not living in a Christian way, but goes towards the non-Christian longing that they meet Jesus. And that's one reason why I would handle the invitations very differently. And the conversation I would be having with a non-Christian friend, if I decided to go and they knew, well, partly because of my job, what my stance on this is, I think I would be saying, look, it isn't the way that I want you to live, but my priority for you ultimately is that you meet Jesus, and I want to hang around with you so we can talk about him ultimately, something like that.
And that's absolutely right. I think mission is a big issue, and I suppose I also want to make sure that I'm not expecting more from my non-Christian friends than I'm prepared to do myself. So I think about the sort of stuff I'd like them to come to at church. When I got baptised, I invited non-Christian friends, and I knew that the service was going to involve praying and singing and reading the Bible, loads of stuff they didn't believe in, but I wanted them to come to support me and to hear from the Bible Bible and hopefully meet Jesus. But if I'm not prepared to go into their world at all and get involved in anything that's important to them, then I think sometimes there's just a danger that we just sort of drive people away, or we only do relationship on our terms. And I think you're right that we are called to go into the world and to be the presence of Jesus wherever, and just to love our friends well, and that means, you know, caring about them. But I would always want to caveat it with explaining. I mean, if they're a good friend, they're going to know what I believe anyway, because doing this job kind of means you can't hide it. I would hope that I could have open and honest conversations about sexuality with them, and that, you know, that we can agree to disagree, and that I can love them even if I don't kind of approve of their relationship.
I think probably just another thing that's worth just saying on all of this is that, particularly when this is a close friends or close family, this is just going to be a really heart-rending decision you're going to have to make. And getting the support of other Christians and sharing this with other Christians, and having a church where actually it's fine to talk about the fact that you have got this gay brother or sister, your gay child, and you really need help to try and work through these issues. And where people are allowed to work through these issues, recognizing that people's consciences will land in different places is going to be really important. Because it can be a really lonely thing to be, let's say, the one family member who's struggling with whether or not they should go to the gay wedding of a sibling or a child. And actually, church has been supportive and loving, and creating an atmosphere where these things can be talked about and worked through is going to be really important. Because I've been to weddings where the one thing I want to do at the end of the day is just sit down and cry. Because I just was, I'd been through something that it just did not feel right. It was just such a sad day. And to do that alone was really difficult. To do that in company would still be difficult, but be better. And I think just making sure that, if somebody who is listening into this podcast, this is a live issue for them, do get the support and the help of other Christians, and if you're one of the other Christians trying to give that help and support, do try and do it in a way that really supports this friend for a really difficult, for family member, for a really difficult situation in which it's hard to get it completely right, and it will be really, really painful.
Absolutely. We need all the help we can get. We need to be praying. We need to be loving our friends well. We need to be seeking God's wisdom. We need to be supporting one another as Christians. So that's a good place, I think, to end today's show. We have got an article on the website which tackles this question, should I go to a gay wedding? And we'll put in the show notes some other resources as well, so that you could do a bit more thinking about this whole issue. But time is up for today. So do go to our website for further resources. I want to say a big thank you to Andrew and Andy and Ed for joining me. And thank you to all of you who are listening as well. Don't forget to like us and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And if you do rate things, then do give us a rating, because it just helps us to be discovered by other people. And we hope that people find it helpful to listen to us. So it's bye for now, but we look forward to seeing you again very soon.